The Lord be with you.
And also with you.
And good morning. Anniversaries are risky times. 500th anniversary of the Reformation is probably especially risky. If you've been married for any amount of time and you've forgotten an anniversary, you know the immediate risk. There's very little risk of us forgetting the 500th anniversary of the Reformation. It's just a matter of the calendar. And when 2017 rolls around, whether we like it or not, and I think we might be celebrating the wrong thing, whether we like it or not, we're going to be doing something to remember the Reformation at 500. I actually think the date is wrong, and I've made this case before and I'll make it again, that we shouldn't be celebrating 2017 because 2017 was it was a significant year. Luther's posting of the 95 Theses was important. It led to many other things, but in my opinion, it simply wasn't the beginning of the Reformation. Luther wasn't even Lutheran in 2017, not by a long shot. He was still Luther, but Luther doesn't make the Reformation. And I think the fact that I got into an argument with Paul McCain about this, which is not hard to do, about commemorating the Reformation at 1517. And of course, he sent me about 100 pictures of commemorative coins that have been, which they have at CPH, which have been struck every year since the Reformation that all say 1517 on them. And I said, that proves nothing whatsoever. You can show me all the coins you want, because the Reformation doesn't begin really with Luther. It's not about Luther. That should be obvious to all of us. If anything, we should be celebrating either the presentation of the Augsburg Confession, in which we'd have to wait another 13 years to celebrate our 500th, or I think even better, although none of us will be around for it, the actual presentation of the Book of Concord, in which we'd be waiting another, now I can't do the math, 17 minus 80. I'll be dead. Yeah. So that some of the children here could celebrate that one as a 500th anniversary, but none of us in this room will still be around except for the children to celebrate it. But I think because all those coins have been struck, and I think because the image of a man posting something on a church door, regardless of what that something says, is just so compelling and always has been. We're stuck with 1517, and so we're stuck with 2017. And you can try and change history before it happens, but once it's here, you're stuck with it. So anniversaries are risky times. What you remember and what you forget. My wife and I are celebrating our 30th wedding anniversary this year. And what you remember after 30 years is very important, but what you also choose to forget after 30 years is equally important. That's how you last 30 years as husband and wife, is forgiving and forgetting most of the stuff that happens every day. We have our daughter and her husband and our grandson living in our house right now. Our house is 1,300 square feet. I added some in the basement, but that's occupied by my son, so no one goes there. It doesn't count. So, and right here in this year where we're celebrating our 30th wedding anniversary. So I get to see the fruit of 30 years every day when I come home from work. And it's usually in the form of everybody standing in the kitchen, which doesn't fit everybody, with a baby crawling on the floor. And let's see, counting their animals and our animals, 3 dogs and 7 cats. So it's nice to see the product of 30 years. I could do without the dogs, and I could do without the cats. So could my daughter now that she has a child of her own. But see, those were decisions she made 5 or 6 years ago, not thinking, I will have a baby one day and I won't want these dogs anymore. You can't change history once it's happened. I'm going to talk about cliches, and I want to say at the outset that cliches are not necessarily bad things. Our life is in a lot of ways lubricated by one cliche after another. We use them as the shorthand for our lives. It makes dealing with one another much, much easier. Cliches can capture truth and keep it. They can also capture truth and twist it just enough to be harmful. And I wanted to talk about 2 cliches in the life of the Reformation that have proven, I think, at least up to this point, at 500 years, harmful. Also, to say something at the outset about 500 years. It's a long time, but it's also a very short amount of time. When viewed in the perspective of the church's history, 500 years is, well, it's a big chunk of it. When viewed in the perspective of a single human life, 500 years seems big. When viewed in the perspective of the church from creation, it gets a little smaller. There were some people in the first centuries of our world for whom 500 years was middle age. They weren't taking their little blue pills until they hit 500. They weren't looking for sports cars or convertibles until they hit 500. So even in the perspective of human life there, it's not that big. But in the perspective of eternity, which ought to be the church's constant perspective, 500 years is not a lot. It's not insignificant because no time is insignificant to God. That's God's perspective. And it is something to celebrate. But God has been doing things from before the foundation of the world, and He has been purposing things from all eternity that He is accomplishing here in time. And God doesn't celebrate a lot of anniversaries. They just don't mean that much. He really only has 2 marks on His calendar, and that is the promise of Christ into this world here in time given to Adam and Eve, and its ultimate fulfillment when Christ, having fulfilled that promise, returns to hand all of time and eternity back over to the Father to be celebrated forever. And that's not an anniversary you can count in years. So as great as 500 years is, I want us to have an eternal perspective on it. That it's good for us here in time to celebrate these things, but with the eternal perspective, our celebrations ought to always be tempered by what God has been doing from before the foundation of the world, rather than what we, sad to say, often take credit for having done over 500 years. And that's another thing I want to emphasize here, and it's not to put a damper on 500 years, but none of us can take credit for it. We are only the latest in a long line of very, very incompetent handlers of God's Word. We may stand in the stream of the Reformation, but there is nothing at 500 that we should celebrate as our accomplishments. What we have built, what we have established, what we have done. Instead, we would celebrate what God's Word has done. And that we have, solely by God's grace, been given an opportunity to participate in. The 2 cliches that I wanted to deal with, I'm going to deal with one in a short form and the other in a longer form. are a little Latin, semper reformanda. Does anyone tell me what that means?
Always reforming. Church must always be reformed.
Yeah, okay. Somebody got the actual voice of that correctly. Who said that? Oh, there we go. Semper reformanda, always reformed. Actually, the longer phrase is the church reformed is always being reformed. Now, you said always reforming, right? Which makes it sound a little bit more like the church is kind of busy doing reforming stuff. Again, it's a divine perspective. The Reformation is not something that the church, it's not a church program that the church designed and set out to do. It's something that God accomplished and always has been accomplishing in His church. It's actually not a Lutheran idea. It is a Reformation idea if you think about the Reformation in broader terms, like including all the people who were doing their own thing during the Reformation. Its origins are not with Lutheran reformers, this idea that the church is always being reformed. Its origins actually, and it makes perfect sense if you stop and think about it, are with the Reformed, are with the Zwinglian and the Calvinistic wings of the Reformation. And that idea is perfectly at home among the Reformed. This idea that the church must always be undergoing this process called Reformation. There's even a magazine published by a good friend of mine, Michael Horton, called what? Modern Reformation. It's perfectly at home in the Calvinist and the Zwinglian wings of the Reformation. This idea that, it's the idea that Luther and his colleagues didn't clean their plates. They left stuff undone that we need to continue to do. That's where the idea actually comes from. It comes from the 17th century. And believe it or not, and it shouldn't surprise anybody that it was actually popularized by Karl Barth, one of the leading light theologians of that very wing of the Reformation. He popularized this idea that the church reformed is always reforming, semper reformanda. Or as we should probably say, the church reformed is always being reformed. I said before that cliches can capture truth and preserve it and communicate it, or a cliche can capture truth and twist it just enough to be harmful. Back to my 30th wedding anniversary. There's a cliche that I use all the time with my wife, and she uses it with me. It's now that my new phone, when you leave a voice message, it transcribes it for you, and you get to see how totally incoherent everyone who calls you really are. I got a voicemail from an elderly pastor who pastors the congregation that I did my first years out of the seminary, and he left me a 4-minute voicemail, and the iPhone transcribed the entire thing. And I told him, I said, Bill, I started reading your voicemail, but come on, it was 4 minutes long. What you should do is put the point up front, up top, and then the rest, you can say everything else after that, but please make the point first so that I don't have to read 4 minutes of text. And then he spent 4 minutes explaining to me why he had to say all those things. When I text my wife, when I call my wife, when I talk to her, when we wake up in the morning, when I leave for work, when I come home from work, when we go to bed, when she leaves the room, What's the cliche? I love you. We're a big I love you family. There's lots of I love yous in the Wilken house. Back and forth. It can capture truth, and it can communicate it and preserve it. It can also capture that truth and twist it just enough. So that sometimes I love you in an I love you family doesn't always mean I love you. It should, but it doesn't always mean that exactly. Sometimes at the end of a conversation with my wife, when I've been particularly annoying to her, which is a lot, I'm an annoying person, I love you coming from her sounds a little bit like, now just go away and leave me alone at the end of the conversation. Now, does she love me? Yes, she does. She has to. It could not, I guarantee you, could not have lasted 30 years unless this woman loved me deeply. But the cliche has a way of sometimes taking something that could be good and is good in its origin and twisting it just enough so that it becomes something other than what it was. And we do it all the time with things like good night. Sometimes good night means I love you, have a good night's sleep, sleep tight, don't let the bugs bite, all those warm and fuzzy things. And sometimes good night means I'm done talking to you, now shut up. If we say that the church is always being reformed or always reforming, what mischief has that wrought in the church? Well, we can start again with Calvinism. If they actually believed that the reformers in Germany left things undone, a good Calvinist never leaves a room without sweeping it up and vacuuming it and turning off all the lights and making sure all the chairs are up on the tables, right? That's Calvinism. Everything must be left exactly in order. One chair out of place when the basement's cleaned up might mean you're not elect. Who knows? So they had to essentially clean up Luther's mess. He left the room not ready for its next occupant, and they had to clean up his mess. And at least from their perspective, they did, because the church needs to be reformed. Luther and his colleagues did not finish the job. Calvin says, I'll finish it. And then if you talk to Calvinists, they'll tell you, well, Calvin, he got almost everything finished. But not one man cannot finish everything. So the history of Calvinism has been, in small ways, they would say they've refined their theology. But what they really have been doing is always trying to fix what they think was left undone by the previous generation. It's why they interact and engage their confessions. And Calvinists do have confessions. They have almost as many as Lutherans, spread out over more years. It's why they interact and engage with their confessions in a very, very different way than Lutherans interact and engage with their confessions. They view them as provisional. They're good, they have some great things to say, but for them, the Westminster Confession or all the other confessions that have been assembled is part of that ongoing reforming process of the church, and so nothing can ever be final. It always must be, at least in some sense, provisional, open to further interpretation or change. Now, there are some things that they probably feel like they've closed the door on, like the sovereignty of God. But if you actually talk to real Calvinists, people who hold to those confessions, and some of them hold to this one and that one, it's pretty much of a grab bag of Quatenus subscription among Calvinists. If you ask individual Calvinist pastors and lay people, they will give you the very distinct impression, sometimes they will actually tell you, we're still working out the bugs on that doctrine. Ask them about, say, eternal election, and you can get 3 Calvinists and 4 answers. Because they all have a slightly different tweak on the problems that still exist in their formulation of those doctrines. They're fully aware that there are tensions between what they have confessed in the past and what Scripture says. And they're trying to tune it up. I just don't think you can find a thoroughly quia that is not insofar as, but because subscription to the confessions of Calvinism among Calvin's theological descendants. And it's because, in a lot of ways, this cliche of the first guys didn't get it finished and we have to finish up for them has run the show. I'm fully aware that this is being taped and that there will be Calvinists who will watch this sometimes 25 years from now and will call me in the nursing home and say, "You're just dead wrong." And I'll say, "What? Who is this?" But Semper Reformanda has come to function as a cliche that has given, at least in their case, they feel like they're refining the truth, trying to come to a better understanding of what they think the Reformation was all about originally. They don't leave the old stuff behind. They're trying to tweak the old stuff and get a better understanding of it, or a more coherent understanding of it. But if you take this idea that originated among the Reformed and try and transplant it into the Lutheran Reformation, that cliche that is attempted to capture truth but twisted it just a little bit, this idea that Luther and his colleagues, insofar as what they had to say in the Lutheran confessions, didn't finish the job, that becomes a recipe for disaster. I am not arguing that the Lutheran confessions said everything that ever needed to be said by Lutherans. That's impossible. We are always going to continue to articulate and apply the theology of the Lutheran confessions in an ever-changing world. That doesn't even need to be said. I know of no one who believes that we come to 1580 and we stop saying things. The Lutherans who put pen to paper on those confessions certainly didn't believe that. The men who actually published the Book of Concord in 1580 certainly didn't believe that. They kept talking and writing and articulating their theology for the rest of their lives. And we should, by the way, listen to them. They knew a lot more about what the Reformation was about than we do. But there was something about the publication of the Book of Concord that did put a period at the end of the sentence for Lutherans, and not a comma. There was something about the publishing of the Book of Concord that said, look, we've done everything we can do in our time, and with this book we say that what was first said at Augsburg in 1530, now 50 years later, and think about that, 50 years, these were patient people. We can't wait 50 years for anything. Now 50 years later, for this time right now, in where we live, this is what we have said, and will stand by it all the way to Christ's second appearing. I love reading both the introduction to the Book of Concord and the conclusion of the Formula of Concord. They both have, there's beautiful bookends there, and they both have exactly the same thing to say, which is, look, this is for posterity. This is what we believe and will believe until we die, and this is what we will believe and confess when Christ returns. We will stand by it. A period at the end of the sentence, rather than, Well, this is provisional. We need to think about it a little bit more. We can't live long enough to make all the changes that need to be made, so we'll leave it to the next generation to make those changes. No, if you actually look at the Book of Concord and you look for this idea of posterity in the Book of Concord, it rings like a bell. These men, all the way through, from the first documents to the last, are fully aware that what they're writing is for the ages and not just for their age. They intended to leave this confession of faith to their children and their grandchildren, to their congregations and to the congregations that would exist long after they're dead. There was not in their mind the idea that they were leaving something essential unfinished, but really that they had finished, insofar as they could, the task of the Reformation. What does that mean for us today? It means that while we certainly leave the reforming of the church to God, again, that passive voice, the church is always being reformed. And that's God's business. Insofar as we are concerned, we don't look back at the Reformation 500 years later as though it were one of those renovation jobs that everybody has in their mind. I'll just use my example. I mentioned that I had finished my basement. This was only after the alarm of having a grandchild was rung. My daughter came home one day and said that she actually just came back from a Cardinals game. We were eating dinner. This was before they were living with us. Oh, those were the days. The sun was streaming in. It was beautiful. She came home from a Cardinals game and she said, "I brought you something from the Cardinals game." And I was so excited because I'm a Cardinals fan. And I thought, I don't know, a bobblehead. And I'm sitting there, what am I going to do with this? And I look inside the bag, and there's a Cardinals onesie. For those of you who haven't had children in a while, a onesie is that little outfit that the babies wear. And it took me about half a minute to process what I was seeing. And that was the very moment when Wilken decided that he had to finish the basement. That for 28 years, no, we'd only been in the house about 17 years, that for 17 years I had been promising to finish for my wife. That's how much she loves me. Are you going to finish the basement this year? This year, honey. This year it's going to happen. And then when I realized I was going to have a grandchild, and that one of the rooms upstairs, which my son was currently occupying, would have to become a nursery, it became my highest priority in life. And I finished it in record time. My wife said, well, if all it took was a baby, we could have done that. But it did happen in dribs and drabs, though. It was when the kids were in high school, I put up the studs. And then when my daughter moved away with her Marine husband 5 or 6 years ago, I ran the electrical. Then I bought some lights to put in the ceiling, and they sat down in the basement for about 2 years. It was, for the most part, just this long, unfinished job of renovation. If we look at the Reformation that way, as though somehow, I got to get down there and hang that drywall at some point, then that's just the beginning of another nightmare. If we look at the Reformation that way, we really are more at home in the world of Calvinism or the Reformed. This is why I think the longer I'm a Lutheran pastor, the more I realize what I was taught in the seminary, but it just took so long to sink in. In my case, it just took decades to sink in. When I sat in the classroom of Jerry Eichmann, and he forced us, I don't know who else here might have sat in that classroom over the years, and we were forced to, we had to memorize big swaths of the Lutheran, do you remember that, George? Big swaths of the Lutheran confessions to pass his tests that were otherwise unpassable. And he was a very smart instructor. He said, all these tests are on file over the library. If you want to go over and look at them with the answer keys, you can do that. And he realized we thought, wow, we get to look at the tests with the answers? And a very, very smart man realized this is the only way I'm going to get these bozos to actually read the confessions. I realized that after decades, that what makes me a Lutheran has nothing to do with a German surname, has nothing to do with any kind of ethnic connection, has nothing to do with any of those things. What makes me a Lutheran are these confessions. And really nothing more. What they say and confess, and, I should add, what they describe by way of the life of Lutheran pastors and congregations. This is what makes me a Lutheran. And this alone. It's not a minimalist approach to the Lutheran confessions, because it's always Scripture and the confessions. Do the confessions say everything that Scripture says? Well, no, that would just be another copy of the Bible now, wouldn't it? So with the Scripture and the confessions, and when I say confessions, please remember I'm not isolating them from Scripture. I have a sentence that has a clear period, maybe even an exclamation point at the end of it. So I can say to someone, when someone says, what do you Lutherans believe? I can, and it's not an oversimplification to say, I believe what's in here. Even if I don't like what I read in there, I believe it. You don't have to like what you believe. There are lots of things in the Christian faith that you may not like. I did not vow at my ordination to conduct my ministry or to like what the Book of Concord has to say. I did vow to teach and practice what the Book of Concord has to say. And hopefully, over time, one grows even not only to like it, but to love it. And there are two ways that could go. That could make me extraordinarily lazy. And just say, well, what do you believe? I'll just read the book. That's not what the confessions were assembled for. They were assembled so that cliche, the church is always being reformed, in its best sense, not in its twisted sense, but in its best sense, could be true for posterity. And guess who's there in posterity? Me. You. This room is the posterity that the reformers imagined when they spoke and wrote and put their names to these things. That's how, if they would have had such a concept of the church always being reformed, which I don't think they really did, that's how they would have thought of it. And I don't need to mention, because it should be obvious, how the cliche of the church always reforming can be twisted in even more gross ways than it has been by the Reformed and Calvinist wings of the Reformation. There are Lutherans who have taken up the banner of always reforming, and I dare say we'll probably hear a lot from them over the next year, who have taken this as just a blank, not just a blank check, but an entire book of blank checks to be written on the Reformation. We're going to hear a lot of nonsense about Luther as a rebel and a revolutionary who wanted to overthrow the powers that be and who wanted to change everything. I even read this morning, somebody tweeted it. And I don't know who it was. I sure hope they're not in this room, but too bad. They said something like, change is the essence of the Reformation. And I thought to myself, have they been reading my paper? No, they haven't. Change is not the essence of the Reformation. In fact, it's quite the opposite. The Lutheran Reformers, one of their great claims, of which they are deeply proud, is that they hadn't changed a thing. That if anything, if any change was taking place, it was the kind of change which is the change back. Not the change forward, but the change back. Jeff and I have been talking a lot. Jeff is my producer. We've been talking a lot about whether or not the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod will be noticed in 2017. Not that we really need to be, but we're wondering whether or not we'll be noticed because the media is going to be attracted to a story of a kind of a paunchy monks hammering things to church doors. And I told him just this morning, I can see it in my head already, the Frontline episode on the Reformation that's going to appear on PBS. And I can give it to you in about 3 scenes. Luther, struck by lightning. Next thing he does, he gets up and hammers the 95 Theses to the door. Then they're going to skip forward about 400 years, and you'll see Nazis marching in Berlin. And then they're going to skip forward about 50 years or 60 years, and they're going to interview someone from the Lutheran World Federation. What happens in between there is really irrelevant, but that's going to be how the media celebrates the Reformation. It's going to be Luther was a rebel who is a superstitious rebel. That's why he has to get struck by lightning. A superstitious medieval rebel who inadvertently started a revolution that, among other things, which we won't mention, led to Nazism. And then now Lutherans are nice. Largely because they have renounced much of what Luther had to say. Just wait. Mark, just put it on your TiVo, and you can fast forward through it, and I guarantee you that is what you'll see. Lightning, hammering, Nazis marching, and it will end with the nicest Lutheran you ever wanted to meet. And we've been wondering, can we get Harrison in there someplace? He doesn't really fit the narrative, but will the media notice the Reformation if it isn't this constant revolution of change that the world is addicted to? Will the media notice that? Something that says, 500 years ago, something started and something was finished. If we celebrate anything about the Reformation, it shouldn't be how it started, because that was just the start. If we celebrate anything about the Reformation, even if we do it, 63 years early, we should celebrate how the Reformation was finished. That's why I'll continue to advocate until my dying day for Reformation 1580 instead of 1517. I've said this before, and it always annoys Pastor Peterson. The last time I said it, I think he was visibly annoyed. I've always said that Pastor Paul McCain will be marked in history of American Lutheranism for what I consider to be the greatest single contribution to American Lutheranism in our lifetimes, which is the publication of the Reader's Edition of the Lutheran Confessions, which was published for pastors and lay people. When they say Reader's Edition, it's kind of a way of saying, it says on the cover, don't be scared. This book is 500 years old, but it won't hurt you. And the history is super complicated, and it is. I mean, back in the old Triglata, Bente's text on the history of the Reformation was all in like microscopic type. But open this book up, start reading it from the beginning all the way to the end, and you will learn these things that need to be learned for you as a Lutheran. A copy of the Lutheran Confessions that pastors and lay people can actually do with what it was intended to be done. Read it. I was at a Gottesdienst thing, and that was the one where I annoyed Pastor Peterson, where I actually, do we have any seminarians in the house? I'll do it again. One seminarian. All right. Well, then there'll be very little comparison here, so I'll include the pastors too. How many of you pastors, when you were going to the seminary, if you can remember that, how many of you were actually required to read the Book of Concord before they patted you on your head and sent you on your way out into the parish? Really, truly required to read the thing from beginning to end. I noticed all the heads that are raising their hands, with the exception of a few, are pretty gray. I asked this at the Oktoberfest for Gottesdienst a couple of years ago, and there were about, 7 seminarians there, vicars and seminarians. And a couple of them raised their hands. And I thought to myself, how in the world can you be asked honestly to subscribe to something you haven't read? From beginning to end, every word. That's Obamacare. Do we actually expect our pastors to say, I'll subscribe so that I can find out what's in it later? I was just fortunate by circumstance to be required by my doctrine teacher at Concordia Seward, back when it used to be a teacher's college, to read the Book of Concord. That was his required text, and we actually had to read the thing. And I must say, reading it in college, it had very little impact on me. I just simply was not equipped hormonally, intellectually, spiritually to appreciate much of what was in there, but I was required to read it. And then again, as I said, in the seminary, required to read it again. But even when I made my vow in 1990 to believe, teach, and conduct my ministry according to these confessions, these scriptures and confessions, I think any pastor has to say, what I was subscribing to, I might have read twice, but I was not thoroughly acquainted with it. If we want to hang on to the cliche of the church always being reformed, then the best thing we can do is to acknowledge that something wasn't only begun 500 years ago, it was finished 500 years ago. It was published. And if we want the church to always be being reformed, the absolute best way to do it is not to look around in the church and say, what needs to be changed? Look, that list gets longer and longer as time goes by. The best way to do it is open up that book and read it again. And ask ourselves those critical questions. Do I believe this? Not do I like it, but do I believe this? And if I say, not really, then to immediately pray, Lord, help my unbelief. And ask the other critical question, does this describe my theology, my preaching, my writing, my thinking? Does this describe my church, my worship, my pastoral practice? Pastor Larry Bean was brilliant a couple years ago when he observed that the Lutheran confessions, even if you want to just take them as, that's descriptive, that's not proscriptive, well, he said, good. Does it describe you? It should. So while I don't think we should dispense with the cliche of the church always being reformed, we need to handle it very, very carefully. And we need to handle it like Lutherans handle it. And that means to take up our confessions, to know them, to let them guide us in everything, to let them become our language, our lexicon for how we speak and how we think. And that will lead to next time's presentation on the other cliche that has proven harmful to Lutheranism, and that is that Lutheranism is radical. But I'll take some questions if there's time. Yes, sir.
It's worth noting that President Harrison served as pastor at Zion just down the street. And while he was there, he persuaded them to change their name. They went from Zion Evangelical Lutheran Church to Zion Evangelical Lutheran Church of the Unaltered Augsburg Confession, which is to reinforce what happened in 1580. In spite of the 50 years and all that had happened in there, Book of Concord contains the unaltered Augsburg Confession.
That's a very good point.
And in that sense, it's a period, yea man, an exclamation point.
Yeah, and I think we need to, and that's what that reader's edition is very helpful. And you realize that the man who first wrote the Augsburg Confession and its defense, Philip Melanchthon, was a brilliant lay theologian. That should teach us two things. We need lay theologians. We would not have had a Reformation without the laity, without both guys like Philip Melanchthon and the princes, by the way, who made it happen with their signatures. Luther didn't sign the Augsburg Confession. His prince did, lay theologians. But the other thing I think is very important that you point out there is that to put that period at 1580, much of what the reformers were doing there in bringing the thing to a close, binding it up and publishing it, was to say, and it's amazing how often they, at the end of the book, reference the Augsburg Confession and its defense. They're quoting it over and over and over again in the Formula of Concord. They realize they're coming to the end of something, and they want to harken back to what they first confessed 50 years before. Maybe in some cases, not even they themselves, but people before them confessed. So they're quoting the Augsburg Confession. Just like we said in Augsburg. Just like we said in Augsburg, they say. And they're quite conscious of the fact that Melanchthon's fiddling with the Augsburg Confession after Luther dies. That he's rewriting it, that he's writing his, like Goldberg, or like Bach or Mendelssohn, writing variations on his original thing. And the sad part is really that Melanchthon probably viewed the Augsburg Confession as his baby. And look, if I wrote the thing, right, I can rewrite the thing. But that is, by the way, not how the rest of the reformers viewed the Augsburg Confession. It was not Melanchthon's document, much less to reform. And they were, in a way, saying, stop fiddling with it. This is the one that we're talking about, not the next one or the next one that you're going to write. But Melanchthon did that with all of his things. He wrote his famous commonplaces, Loci Communes. Luther says, next to the Bible. And then Luther dies, and Melanchthon continues to rewrite it until it's a thoroughly Calvinist document in 1555. Pastor Peterson was up.
Thanks. Thank you for the information on the Semper Reformata. I didn't know that. I had no idea that was used that way. And I've always misunderstood it and seen it in a very positive sense as kind of a shield against the idea of kind of triumphalism, that, you know, we've arrived and we're the... So I just, there is something to be said for recognizing that we need to be reformed by God and we need to stay in these confessions. And just because, you know, we're the Church of the Lutheran Hour, we got it all hacked.
Well, yeah, Logia just came out with their latest edition of that, and I hope I don't offend any Logia types here. There might be a few out here. But they just came out with their latest, and the title is Lutheran Triumphalism, with an extremely unfortunate cover. Beautifully, beautifully painted, by the way, by a very skilled artist. But I think just, and I'm not saying anything out of school, I've already whined to all of the editors privately. So leave your Matthew 18 at home. And the thing's out now so everyone can see. A pastor, sleeves rolled up, in a clerical, holding a banner that's flying behind him with Luther's coat of arms on it, and clutching a Book of Concord. And written right over his chest is Lutheran Triumphalism. And I saw it and did what Wilken does. I immediately began to complain. And somebody said, well, if they just would have put an LLL pin on his lapel, it might have been more. Lutheran Triumphalism is not, when you see a pastor holding his confessions dear, give thanks for that. That's not Lutheran Triumphalism. That is semper reformanda in the perfect sense. Lutheran Triumphalism is a big problem in the 500th anniversary. It truly is. This idea that somehow we're going to, as we always used to hear in the Walter A. Meyer days, we're going to somehow fill up stadiums with people who are just dying to hear all this. No, we won't. We never have. We can manage to fill up stadiums, but we have to provide some sort of incentive to them, and it's not going to be the Reformation that draws them in. It's probably going to be free beer or something like that. Yes, Pastor.
I doubt that the major emphasis is ever going to touch 1580 in this year. The press is going to love to pick up on the idea that what Luther gave us was individualism. And look at how our rainbow religious picture today is the fulfillment of that idea of individualism. And it turns the Reformation upside down. I would love it if there would be a little Lutheran triumphalism, but I don't think we're going to get much of it.
There was an article in The Economist that this last week that was talking about the legacy of Luther in Germany, and it described Luther's legacy. It kind of said at the beginning, well, Luther was a theologian, yada, yada, yada. But what really matters is that Luther reformed the economic system. He introduced us to the middle class with his emphasis on vocation and things like that. And he invented the middle class. And so revolutionized our economic system. And in the area of aesthetics, interestingly enough, the Lutherans kind of, for some reason, kept all that architecture and art, although they made no contributions. Somehow The Economist, forgetting the name J.S. Bach. I don't know how they did that, but somehow they forget that Lutherans didn't make much contribution in the area of the arts or the sciences, which is just... But they did keep old church buildings. And I talked to Uwe Simonetto about it, and Uwe is always in a state of mild agitation. And then when fueled with a couple glasses of wine, and I was talking to him from Germany, so he was in a different, it was 5 o'clock there someplace. When fueled with a couple glasses of wine, he goes into medium agitation. And there's a button someplace on Uwe that is rage mode. And this article in The Economist just had him in rage mode. Not only because it underappreciated Luther's theological, but because he says this is what the world is going to say that the Reformation was about. They're going to say it was about economic or artistic revolution, or as you, I think, rightly pointed out, about kind of recognizing the individual before God, and then that somehow becomes everybody gets to self-determine their identity.
That seems to be a theme in some of Alistair McGrath's writing about Luther, that individualism and that the discovery of the individual conscience and carrying that out. And if you secularize that enough, then you end up with this liberal dream of anything goes pluralism today.
Yeah, and McGrath doesn't mean to head that direction.
I agree, but
he's reading Luther, he's trying to read Luther in terms of kind of a broader impact And it's certainly, McGrath would never support it being used to talk about self-determination.
That's how people read McGrath today.
Yep. Well, that actually raises one other thing I wanted to say, and that is, if we want to believe that if we want the Reformation to continue among us, we don't need any new Luthers. One was plenty enough. Okay? There's enough Luther back in the 1600s to last us a lifetime. All right? And what we don't need new Luthers, because if you read much of what Luther wrote, it's quite clear that Luther, while his theology is encapsulated there in the Lutheran confessions, especially there in the catechisms and in the small called articles that he actually wrote. And while much of his writings are highly commended by the Lutheran confessions, like Great Galatians and these other things, and while the Lutheran confessions do say on more than one occasion that he is the church's primary teacher, we want to accept all of those things. When God made Luther, he broke the mold. All right? We don't need any more of him. What we need is what was left to us for posterity, those confessions. That's why I always say, look, if you find Luther contradicting the confessions, you are free to disregard Dr. Luther. And Luther often overstated his case, and he often understated his case, and Lutheranism is not built on cherry-picked Luther quotes, which in the age of the internet, you can find Luther saying anything. So it's not a Lutheranism that listens to Luther, but listens to Luther via the Lutheran confessions. Anybody else? Let's see. I'm going to go back to the rail back there. The man standing by the rail.
So, Pastor Wilken, from what I understand you're saying about Semper Reformata, the healthy way to do this is to know our confessions and combat the error that we see happening in the church with our confessions. Yeah. What would you say is the most pressing error in the Missouri Synod right now? Most pressing.
It's a dangerous question. This is not to minimize any of the other grave concerns that we ought to have about the state of confessional Lutheranism in America today, okay? Because there are all kinds of things that are real problems. I mean, I could just mention, and some of them are so obvious, no one should even be saying they're a problem. They should just be dismissed outright. This isn't my answer. This is just my preliminary. You have organizations like Bill Woolsey's 5-2 down in Texas, and I've spoken about it many, many times in public. I just think I said this is not a movement they're destined to take over. It's destined to take off. I think we're just watching one man's exodus from the Missouri Synod. And he might drag some people with him. I'm not concerned about that because I've been a pastor for now 26 years, and I've seen Bill Woolsey a dozen times. His name was different before, and he came in a different form, and most of the time he worked directly for Synod. But I've seen these things come and go, and with the emphasis on the go. They simply do not last. They're one man's idea. And some of them have greater impact than others, and some of them last a little longer, and some of them actually get instituted into synodical things and get logos and stuff like that. But they come and go. And so while that is a very pressing thing, something like that, what concerns me there probably more is that, at least for the time being, on the speakers circuit, Bill Woolsey is still being listened to by a lot of people. When, in terms of his theology of the ministry, and I think we could all agree on this, his theology of the ministry has just departed entirely, not just from what is Lutheran, but what is even sensical. It's everything. If everything's ministry and holy ministry, then nothing is. And his redefinition of the word sacrament or sacramental is just, as my daughter would say, just cuckoo beans. But I think those things go. Most pressing, and again, I have to say this from an almost completely personal standpoint, I have realized over the course of the last 10 years, not because I have come to these conclusions myself, but because I have been forced kicking and screaming to come to these conclusions by others who were patient with me, especially given the soapbox that I have. People who have over the years emailed me or called me or talked to me and said, Wilken, you are wrong on this. You are underselling our confessions. Go back and read them. This is my personal perspective here. That for the first 10 or 15 years of my ministry, I unwittingly bought into a version of Lutheranism I'm going to discuss this afternoon that was Lutheran flavored. You know what I mean? We have 2 bottles of syrup in the Wilken house, one my daughter's and one everybody else's. The rest of us don't care about high fructose corn syrup, all right? So we don't mind if the bottle says, if it says maple flavored syrup. We just don't care. I've consumed so much high fructose corn syrup by this time, I'm probably mostly composed of it. And then there's my daughter's bottle, which is very small and very expensive and needs to be carefully refrigerated after opening, of real maple syrup, which maybe it's because my taste buds have been ruined by high fructose corn syrup, but I just don't taste the difference. She does. All right? It is not maple flavored. It is taken directly from a maple tree and boiled until it is syrup. There's no flavoring in it. It's just the sap of a maple tree, the sap of the tree itself. And I think I'm not doing my penance. Yeah, I'm doing my penance in a lot of ways. I have to at some point go back and rewrite many of the things I have written over the years. And not completely retract them, but I got to rewrite them. Because I spent a lot of time kind of being a little Lutheran, overstating my case and understating the case for Lutheranism in many of its doctrines, in terms of sanctification and the third use of the law, in terms of the real relationship between justification and sanctification, and law and gospel. And I realized that what I was doing was Lutheran flavored. If you just took a little sip of it, you couldn't tell the difference. But if you actually look at the label, you realize it tastes like it, but it isn't the sap of the tree. So, with great reluctance, because I'm a very proud person, and I've said so many things over the years, I've been doing this for 18 years, publicly, that I probably, if I had to take back, I'm starting to sound like Luther. If I had to take them back, I should take them back. And I have preached and taught things. I think by the grace of the Holy Spirit, not to the detriment of the souls that heard me, but that if compared with the real article, would not prove true in very subtle ways. And so I think what the greatest thing that's facing us, and this is multi-generational, it didn't start with me and it didn't start with 10 years ago, it started earlier in the 20th century, with what I call Luther's 20th century interpreters, who gave us a version of Lutheranism that was Lutheran flavored, but not Lutheran, not sap of the tree. And I think that's what faces us now, is to say, and it's just a challenge of individual pastors and lay people to each other, is what you're saying, writing, believing, teaching, preaching, is that really in the book? And if you look at the book there, are you saying everything it says? Or are you cutting it off at some point and not saying what needs to be said, what the Lutheran confessors would have boldly said? And what I've discovered is a Lutheranism with which I am personally much less comfortable than I was for the first 15 years of my ministry. One that is deeply, deeply challenging. Challenging because it is a tremendous balancing act between truth and error. It walks the knife's edge, and it's also very challenging because it simply does not permit me to be lazy in how I think first, and then how I teach and preach. I can't be lazy anymore about it. It does not allow me to be sloppy anymore. So that's the challenge, I think, that is kind of the long-term challenge. And it's in the pipeline because it was fed to all of us through seminary professors who didn't mean to say these things, but said them nonetheless, and in their own way overstated their cases, from both seminaries, by the way. And they say, James May says in Africa, the saying is, the teacher pees while he walks, and the students pee while they run. So it's been magnified by generations of students who one teacher overstates the case a little, and the students say, I'm going to do him one better and overstate it a little bit more. And pretty soon, it's the telephone game. You get down to that third generation or more years in the ministry, and it stops even sounding. You go back to the original guy and say, is this what you taught? Oh, no. I might have said that in the classroom, but I never intended to teach that. We need to guard against that. But again, the answer to that is what I said earlier today. Just the touchstone. A touchstone is if without being touched, is just a stone. It is intended to be touched and always maintained contact with, so that, and our touchstone are those confessions. We are so blessed to have this. If we were Calvinists, we would just be flailing around, make it up as we go along. None of us need to do that. And we don't need to improve upon what has already been said. We just need to say it again. Anyone else? I'm going to go one more and then I'll come back to you, sir. I'm making you wait.
Would it be a correct understanding of the good use of the cliche to say that as the world changes, which it does, it just keeps going forward, new ideas, new things, we have to be reformed back to what is original truth? It's kind of like Pilate's question, what is truth? And of course Jesus said, I am the way, the truth. The confessions then like that are that truth, and truth should never change. Is that about what you're saying?
Yeah, changed back, like I said, changed back, not changed forward.
Right.
Changed back, always returning back again to the font, and both literally and figuratively, returning again to the font of our baptism. I mean, isn't that the Christian life? Right. The Christian life is over and over again every day, I am baptized, which doesn't just mean I'm thinking about my baptism. That doesn't do you any good to think about it. Baptism has a power, and the power is death and life, and the death must precede the life, but the life must follow the death.
Right.
Otherwise, it isn't baptism. Baptism, not just death. It's death and life. A day, again and again, over and over again. And back to the font of our confession. Because we're baptized into a confession of faith. That's why we confess the faith over little babies when they're baptized. We do it in the simplest form, the Apostles' Creed, right? But we are baptizing these children. We're baptizing our children into three things. The big thing is Christ's death and resurrection. The other two things are the family of God. That's why we baptize in church, as church. And then the third thing is into a confession of faith. And so I think it's thoroughly connected as font as water and font as our confessions. Now, you've been so patient.
Very good. I just had I had a comment and then a question. The comment is that the church I happen to serve now was built in 1929, and on the cornerstone it has the letters UAC. It says the Church of Our Savior Evangelical Lutheran UAC. And this is a wonderful teaching tool for me with my people to express the importance of the Augustana. And I discovered in the constitution of the church at that time, those wishing to be members were required not only to know the small catechism, but also the unaltered Augsburg Confession. I'm very grateful for all that. But my question is this. You brought up the matter of whether those who subscribe to the Book of Concord at their ordinations have read that book. And my question is this: do we know, or can we know, whether both our seminaries require their students to have read the entire Book of Concord before they can be certified for ordination?
That's two different questions. Do we know and can we know? Answer to the first one is no. Answer to the second one is yes, we can know. I just think maybe we've assumed it.
But how can this be that and I think I know which one it is, but how they can permit these young men to go out and take their oath in the presence of God and the church to teach and preach and administer the sacraments according to the Book of Concord, and they haven't even read it.
Yeah. Well, the last line of defense, of course, is the district president who comes to lay hands on them. And what he should do, the funny thing is, he won't come and lay hands on you if you haven't settled on a salary with the congregation. All the papers have to be signed, and all the paperwork has to be finished through his office before he'll lay hands on you. But he's the last line of defense. He should call the guy the week before and say, by the way, have you read the Book of Concord all the way through from beginning to end? Sir, no, I don't think I have. I've read sections of it, big sections of it. Okay, good. So I'm not coming to ordain you until you've done that. You have a week. That's plenty enough time to read it. Because I need an honest answer from you on Sunday afternoon at 3 p.m. And if you haven't read it, I'm not going. I would think that would be a minimum kind of a thing. That used to occur further back in the process of making pastors.
It seems to me, from what I understand of our polity, it is, when I graduated from St. Louis, I received then it was a bachelor's degree, which morphed into a master's. That was one certificate. And then the other certificate was the faculty certification that I was qualified for ordination to the holy ministry of the Word and Sacraments. It seems to me that in our polity, it's the seminary faculty that have to certify that this is the case, and that they should not certify people for ordination if they haven't even read the book. That makes no sense.
Yeah, I think that's...
Listen, it's in this, I'm about 98% sure of St. Louis, and I'm positive in Fort Wayne. It is required, as a course requirement at the very least. All of the Book of Concord is required reading for a course. I'm not sure that we could say that it's, that they're examined to make sure they've completed it. But at least in minimum, let's just be honest, they are required to read it.
Okay.
Now, maybe the students are dishonest and maybe the professors aren't thorough in ensuring it's done, but at least as a standard, it definitely is the standard.
I think in the coursework that I took in the seminary, it was required. If you didn't, you just weren't passing. So in order to pass a course in confessions, and there are multiple ones of those, there used to be the thing called the theological interview, where the prospective pastor would sit with faculty members, selected faculty members, and answer certain questions. And mine consisted of two questions. Mine consisted of, what commentaries do you have in your library? And my answer was none. And I was sternly told I need to go out and buy like 50 commentaries. It would have been my first year's salary in the parish. And the other one was Dr. Nagel just opening up his Greek New Testament to a spot that he had previously chosen and turning it around and handing it to me. And he just said, translate. And it was 1 Corinthians 3. And that was the extent of my theological interview. I don't think the confessions ever came into play in that. So this is a long-standing problem that, we vet these guys coming into the seminary. I think we need to be, and all of us need the constant vetting of the confessions, but for pastors, you kind of have to do it for yourself. You have to have the gumption to do it for yourself. I'll tell you, I will say this, and I wanted to mention this before. During those 15 years of my ministry, where I was kind of presenting Lutheran-flavored theology, when it was ever pointed out to me, and it was, I'll tell you, the person who usually always pointed it out to me, almost every time, was Will Whedon, who read the book, and actually continues to read the book. Whenever he pointed it out to me, he'd be like, you really need to go and read Formula Concord Article 3, Wilken. That would be the extent of it. And what would I do? You're right. I'd go home and I'd turn on Gilligan's Island. Or SpongeBob SquarePants, and I would not read Formula 3. And I know why I wouldn't read it. I can tell you completely why I wouldn't read it. I didn't want to read something there that would contradict what I held so dear. And I thought, I'm a confessional Lutheran, so to guard my confession from the confessions, I just stayed away from them. And it was not an honest dealing on my part. It simply wasn't. I just avoided things that might contradict what I was holding dear, what I thought was Lutheranism. I preferred my Lutheranism to the confession's Lutheranism. I did. It's that simple. I will say that this is an ongoing process, semper reformanda, Wilken semper reformanda. I love the confessions a lot more than I used to. It's hard to fall in love with something you never have any contact with. Hard to love something that you don't deal with very often. Do we have time for one more? Yes, sir.
I'm just curious about the Reader's Edition. When it came out, I had hoped that it would be widespread and greatly read by the laity. I mean, we've been talking mostly here about clergy and the book reading of the Book of Concord. Do you have any idea what kind of impact it's had on the church and how widely used it is?
I can't say how widely used it is, but I think just in terms of how widely it was sold and distributed, it was a big success. Yeah. There's one anecdote. I served a parish for 9 years. Their major event every year was not a theological conference like this. Their major event every year was making apple butter. And big kettle pots filled with apples and water and sugar, stirred for 8 to 10 hours, and then at the end, you have apple butter. And they would jar it up and they would sell it, and that was their big thing. And for years after I left that parish, since I still live in the area, I would go back for apple butter, to help stir apple butter. And I remember distinctly the year after the Reader's Edition was published, standing next to one of my former parishioners who never went to Bible class, who was somewhat infrequent in his church attendance while I was his pastor, who really never showed any interest in any of these things, like many parishioners do. He's stirring his pot, I'm stirring my pot, and he says, man, that Reader's Edition of the Lutheran Confessions. At the time, it was Pastor Michael Cum, who was eventually my senior pastor and now has moved on to the great South Dakota parish in the sky. He's still alive, he just moved north. He was serving as the vacancy there at my former parish. And he says, Pastor Cum has us reading the Lutheran confessions, like reading assignments. Tonight, read this much. He goes, it's amazing. And he said what I think I've heard many people say from my perspective on the other side of the mic, doing issues, etc. I never knew that I believed this before. A guy, and he was probably in his 60s, been a Lutheran his whole life, finally at long last, falling in love with the Lutheran confession. Now, if that happened once, I'm sure it happened more than once. And that's why I say what I say about Paul McCain's place in the history of American Lutheranism, largely because he got his name on the front cover or on the inside, on the masthead. I'm serious. It'll be Tappert, Kaler, Pieper, Walther, and then a bust of Paul McCain. Its pedestal might be a little lower, but it'll still be there in the Hall of Fame. Well, thank you for your patience. I'll give you a break before lunch.